The eviction notice was pink. Esther had always thought such things would arrive in something darker, black ink on gray paper, something that matched the weight of what it meant. But no. It was pink, almost cheerful, taped to the door of the house she had lived in for 51 years, fluttering slightly in the October wind like a flag of surrender she hadn't agreed to raise. She stood on the porch in her housecoat, 79 years old, her coffee going cold in her hand. The neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. A school bus rolled past.
It's beautiful out here, isn't it?
Sure is,
Life,
Mama.
indifferent and continuous,
Just like I remember.
moved around her while she stood perfectly still, reading the same 3 sentences for the 4th time. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. 30 days. Her husband Harold had been in the ground for 11 weeks. His name was still on the mailbox. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that said "World's Okayest Fisherman," was still in the dish rack because she couldn't bring herself to put it away. And now someone was telling her that even this, even the grief, even the silence, even the sacred ordinary wreckage of a life shared, had an expiration date. She folded the notice carefully. Put it in her housecoat pocket. Went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. Not yet. The house had never technically been hers. That was the part that stung in a way she hadn't expected, not the loss of the house itself, but the realization of how she had never fully understood the architecture of her own life. Harold had handled everything. The mortgage, the insurance, the taxes, the paperwork that accumulated in the filing cabinet in the spare room that she now understood she should have opened years ago. She opened it now. The files were meticulous. Harold had been a careful man, a retired civil engineer who color-coded his receipts and kept warranties for appliances going back to 1987. But the mortgage, she discovered, had been refinanced in 2019 without her full understanding of what that meant. Harold had been sick by then, early Parkinson's making his hands shake and his thinking fog at the edges. Someone had offered him a reverse mortgage arrangement. A company with a clean logo and a friendly phone voice. He'd thought he was protecting her. Instead, he had, unknowingly, signed away the continuity. The house belonged to a holding company now. Technically, it always had, since that signature in 2019. The grace period following Harold's death had expired. The pink notice was perfectly legal. Esther's daughter Renee lived in Phoenix with 3 kids and a mortgage of her own. When Esther called her, Renee cried and said, "Mom, I don't know how we could," and then talked around the impossibility of it for 20 minutes. Her son Dale was in Portland, estranged in the quiet way that families sometimes estrange themselves, no dramatic falling out, just a slow drift, Christmas cards that stopped, calls that got shorter. Until they were strangers who shared a last name. She had $4,200 in her checking account. Social Security came in at $1,140 a month. She had no pension. Harold's small pension had died with him. She was 79 years old and she was, for the first time in her life, genuinely alone with a problem too large to see the edges of. The church ladies brought casseroles. Her neighbor Dot came over and held her hand and said, "Something will work out," with the gentle dishonesty of someone who didn't know what else to say. Esther appreciated the casseroles. She didn't believe the something. She began quietly, methodically, looking at assisted living options. The cheapest decent one was $3,400 a month. The math didn't work. The math hadn't worked before she even started calculating, she just hadn't wanted to see it laid out so plainly. She stopped sleeping well. She'd wake at 2 in the morning and lie in the dark listening to the house settle, all its familiar creaks and sighs. Learning the sounds of a place the way you only learn them when you know you're about to lose it. She started going through things. Deciding what to keep, what to give away, what had been important and what had only felt important because it had been there, filling space, making a house feel inhabited. She found the Bible in the bottom of a cedar chest. It wasn't her Bible. The chest had belonged to her mother, and before that, to her grandmother, a woman named Cora Lee who had died in 1974 when Esther was 31 years old. Cora Lee had been a sharecropper's daughter from rural Georgia. A woman who had moved north to Cincinnati in 1941 with $40 and a cardboard suitcase and had spent the rest of her life working in other people's houses, raising her daughter with a particular fierce quietness that Esther had always mistaken for stoicism. The Bible was old. Black cover, cracked at the spine, the pages tissue-thin and gold at the edges. Inside the front cover, Cora Lee had written the family births and deaths in her careful schoolteacher's handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had taught herself to write beautifully as an act of private dignity. Esther sat on the floor of the spare room and turned the pages slowly. Dried flowers, pressed flat and translucent. A prayer card from a funeral in 1958. A photograph, small and sepia-toned, of a woman Esther didn't recognize standing in front of a wooden house, squinting into the sun, one hand raised as if she was about to say something. And then, tucked between Psalms and Proverbs, folded into a small tight rectangle, a piece of paper that was not a prayer and not a letter. Esther unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle at the creases. It was a deed. A property deed, dated June 14, 1952. Handwritten, notarized with a faded stamp. It described a parcel of land in Claiborne County, Tennessee, 4 acres, along something called Ridgeline Creek Road. Transferred to one Cora Lee Watkins as payment of a debt by a man named Arthur Pell. Esther read it 3 times. Her grandmother had owned land. Her grandmother, who had cleaned other women's houses, who had never owned a car, who had lived in the same 2-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati for 30 years, had owned 4 acres in Tennessee. Had she known? Had Esther's mother known? Why had it been folded up in a Bible and never spoken of? Esther sat on the floor for a long time. The cold from the hardwood seeped through her housecoat. Outside, the October wind had picked up, and the bare oak tree in the backyard tapped its branches against the window like someone politely trying to get her attention. The land was probably nothing. Scrubland, or swamp, or it had been sold off decades ago and this deed was just a ghost of something that no longer existed. That was almost certainly it. But it was also possibly something. At 79 years old, with 30 days becoming 26 becoming 22, possibly something was the most she had. She called Renee the next morning and said, "I need to know if I still own land in Tennessee." There was a long pause. Then, "Mom. What are you talking about?" The first lawyer she called, a property attorney whose number she found online, told her that a deed from 1952 was almost certainly unenforceable given the decades of potential adverse possession, unpaid taxes, or superseding sales. He used words she had to write down and look up. He charged $200 for a 20-minute consultation and made her feel, without being unkind, that she was chasing a ghost. She called another one. This one, a younger woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in estate and property law, was more measured. "It's not impossible," she said. "But you'd need to establish chain of title, check for outstanding tax liens, verify the land hasn't been legally claimed by someone else. And you'd need to actually go there and have the land assessed." "What does that cost?" Esther asked. "Research alone could be $500 to $1,000 before we know if there's anything worth pursuing." $500. Out of her $4,200. With 22 days left. She slept badly again. She thought about Cora Lee, about a woman who had left Georgia at 23 with $40, who had somehow, in 1952, come to own 4 acres of Tennessee land. And who had then never spoken of it, had folded the proof of it into her Bible and let it sit for 70 years. Why? That question was the thread she couldn't stop pulling. She called Patricia Chen back and paid the retainer. Then she called Renee and told her what she was doing. Renee's reaction was complicated. Supportive in the way that people are supportive when they suspect you're making a mistake but don't want to say so directly. Just be careful, Mom, she said. Don't spend money you don't have chasing something that might not be there. She also, quietly, called Dale. That was harder. The phone rang 4 times and she was composing herself to leave a voicemail when he picked up. His voice was the same, her boy's voice, older now, careful. Mom. Just that. Just the word. She told him about the deed. She told him about the eviction. She told him everything, standing in the kitchen with Harold's coffee mug on the counter, and when she finished, there was silence on the line. Why didn't you call me when Dad died? He said finally. I didn't think you'd want, Mom. His voice broke on the single syllable. I would have wanted. They talked for an hour. It wasn't a reconciliation, exactly, those don't happen in a single phone call, not after years of accumulated distance. But something opened. Something that had been sealed. In the meantime, Patricia Chen was doing research. The results came back in pieces over the following 10 days, and each piece was both promising and maddeningly incomplete. The land was real, it existed on county records in Claiborne County, Tennessee. It had been on the tax rolls through 1971, at which point the taxes had gone unpaid. In Tennessee, unpaid property taxes could lead to tax sale, but there was no record of this particular parcel ever being sold at tax sale. It seemed to have simply fallen off the radar. Become invisible. That happened sometimes with very small, rural parcels, Patricia explained. Especially when the owner was, and I'm being honest with you, a black woman in 1952. There may have been deliberate discouragement involved in why she never pursued it. That sentence landed in Esther's chest and sat there, heavy. Deliberate discouragement. The polite legal term for what it meant to be Cora Lee Watkins in Tennessee in 1952, to own something that powerful people would prefer you not own, and to understand. With the survival instinct that shaped black life in the South for generations, that pressing the claim might cost you more than the land was worth. So she had folded the deed in her Bible. She had carried it north. She had kept it. Not as evidence, not as a legal instrument. As testimony. As a record of a truth that she couldn't safely speak aloud. Esther understood, suddenly and completely, that the land was not the point. But the land was still there. Patricia sent her to a county land records office contact in Claiborne County. Then there were forms, and copies, and a notarized affidavit establishing Esther's relationship to Cora Lee Watkins as granddaughter and heir. There were back taxes to research, what was potentially owed, whether there was a path to clearing the title. Esther drove to Tennessee herself. Dale offered to come. She told him not to, then changed her mind and called him back and said yes. He flew in from Portland and met her in Knoxville, and they drove east together through the October mountains, the ridgelines bare and burnished copper in the late-season light. Barely speaking for the first hour, and then somehow unable to stop. She told him things about Harold she'd never said aloud. He told her things about why he'd pulled away, nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of feeling like a disappointment, of thinking it was easier for everyone if he stayed at the edge. She didn't argue with him. She just listened. When they finally turned onto Ridgeline Creek Road, it was late afternoon. The road was gravel, lined with cedar and scrub pine. The GPS lost signal. They found the parcel by the creek. She recognized it from the deed description, the way the land bent south along the water. 4 acres of hardwood and limestone shelf, overgrown and wild and in places genuinely beautiful, the creek running dark and clear over rounded stones. There was no building. Just land. But the land was there. The tax situation was both better and worse than expected. Better, the total back taxes owed, with penalties, came to just over $4,100. Nearly every dollar Esther had. Worse, Because the title had been in limbo for so long, unpaid but not sold, clearing it required a quiet title action. A legal process. More fees, more time. The 30 days expired. She negotiated an extension, Patricia helped, and something in the human decency of the holding company's local representative came through. And she was given 60 more days to find alternative housing while the legal work continued. She moved in with Dot, her neighbor. Dot had a spare room and was quietly, fiercely glad to have her. "You're not a burden," Dot said, in a way that made it clear she'd been wanting to say it for weeks. "Your company." Dale stayed in Tennessee for a week, working remotely. And filed the initial paperwork for the quiet title action with a local attorney Patricia had referred them to, a man named James Whitfield who was from Claiborne County himself. Who looked at the deed and looked at Esther and said, "Your grandmother bought this from Arthur Pell." He paused. "Pell owed her money. I know that family. They've been in this county since before the Civil War." He looked at the deed again. "She was smart to get it in writing." "She was smart about everything," Esther said. The quiet title process took 11 weeks. During those 11 weeks, Esther lived in Dot's spare room, slept better than she had in months. And did something she hadn't done in 50 years of marriage: she learned to be alone without feeling lonely. The distinction, she discovered, was enormous. Loneliness was absence. Solitude was presence, your own presence, with yourself, which she had spent decades outsourcing to Harold, to the house, to the shape of a life organized around another person. She started writing. Not a journal exactly, just notes. Things she remembered about Cora Lee. Stories her mother had told her. The way Cora Lee had smelled like lavender and iron-pressed cotton. The way she'd hummed while she cooked, always the same 3 spirituals, cycling endlessly. The way she'd held the Bible, not reverently, exactly, but the way you hold something that has held you back. She found a local historical society. Began researching Cora Lee's life. The more she found, the more she understood how little she had known, and how much Cora Lee had navigated without ever making it visible. Then the quiet title action resolved. The land was clear. The back taxes were paid, Dale contributed half, without being asked and without making it a thing, which was, Esther thought, exactly the kind of man he had always been underneath the distance. The title was clean. The 4 acres along Ridgeline Creek Road belonged to Esther Marie Watkins Coleman. She stood in the county clerk's office and held the new deed. It had her name on it. She thought, Cora Lee. I found it. I'm sorry it took so long. She didn't say that out loud. But she thought it, very clearly, and it felt like a conversation completed. The land's practical value, when she had it assessed, was approximately $47,000. Not a fortune. Not salvation in any dramatic sense. But it was real, and it was hers, and it changed the mathematics of her life in ways that were subtle and significant. She didn't sell it immediately. That surprised even her. She'd assumed the point was to sell it, pay for housing, buy herself time. And that was still part of the equation. But she found herself unable to simply convert Cora Lee's land into money and move on, as if the deed had only ever been a financial instrument. She hired a local environmental consultant, a young woman named Sarah who drove a muddy pickup and knew every species of tree on the parcel by their bark, who told her the land had good water, good timber, and most significantly, a stretch of creek frontage that a conservation land trust had been quietly trying to acquire pieces of for a watershed protection initiative. The trust offered $52,000 for a conservation easement, not purchasing the land, but purchasing the right to ensure it would never be developed. Esther would retain ownership. The land would stay wild. The creek would be protected. She said yes. $52,000 arrived in her account in January. She used $28,000 of it to purchase, outright, a small manufactured home in a senior community outside Knoxville, 40 minutes from Ridgeline Creek Road, because she wasn't ready to be far from it. The remaining money was security. Actual security, not the theoretical kind that comes from owning things you don't understand. She was not wealthy. She would never be wealthy. But she was stable, which at 79 felt like a different kind of richness than she'd ever known to want. The harder changes were internal. She had spent 51 years being Harold's wife, not in a diminished way, she hadn't felt diminished. She had loved him and chosen the life, but in a way that had organized her sense of self around his presence, his plans, his competence with the things she'd let him be competent about. The eviction, as horrible as it had been, had forced her into a self-sufficiency she hadn't known she possessed. She made her own phone calls now. She understood what a deed was, what an easement was, what a quiet title action was. She had navigated a legal process, across 2 states, at 79 years old, while processing grief and displacement and the slow re-emergence of a son she'd thought she'd lost to distance. She felt, for the first time in years, like someone who was doing her own living. Not without help. Dale, Patricia Chen, James Whitfield. Young Sarah with her muddy truck. Help had been essential and she'd accepted it without the pride that had sometimes made accepting help difficult. But she had been the one at the center of it. She had been the one who unfolded the deed. Who made the calls? Who drove to Tennessee? Who held the new title in the county clerk's office? She started speaking at her new church about Cora Lee. Not a speech, exactly, just telling the story when people asked, and people kept asking. An older woman in the congregation told her she'd had a similar experience with her own grandmother's land in Mississippi. Then another woman said she'd heard of this happening before, these old land claims, especially in rural southern counties, land that had belonged to black families that had been quietly lost. Abandoned under pressure, forgotten or hidden in Bibles and cedar chests. Esther thought about that. She thought about it a lot. She started writing it down more seriously. Not just Cora Lee's story, but the structure of it, how it worked, how land was lost, what the process of recovery looked like, what someone would need to know. She didn't know exactly what she was writing. She just knew it needed to be written. In March, 7 months after she'd first found the Bible, Esther received a letter from James Whitfield in Tennessee. He had, in the course of handling her quiet title action, become curious about similar cases in the county records. He'd found 3 other parcels in Claiborne County with similar histories, small pieces of land that had belonged to black landowners in the early 20th century. Had fallen off the tax rolls in the mid-century decades, and had never been properly reclaimed or sold. They were in legal limbo. They had heirs, probably. No one was looking. He wanted to know if she'd be interested in helping identify those heirs. She read the letter standing at her kitchen counter in her new small home, the morning light coming through the window at a low March angle, bright and tentative. She read it twice. Then she called Dale. "He wants me to help find people," she said. "People who don't know they own land," Dale said. "People whose grandmothers hid deeds in Bibles," she said, and her voice came out strange, compressed, like it was carrying more than words. There was a silence that felt full rather than empty. "Mom," Dale said finally. "Do you know what this means? This isn't just about Grandma Cora. This is, I know what it is," she said quietly. She knew exactly what it was. Cora Lee had not left the deed in the Bible by accident. Esther had turned this over in her mind for months, considering it from every angle, and she had arrived at a conclusion that she couldn't prove and couldn't shake. Cora Lee had known, on some level, that the time was not right. That pursuing the land herself, a black woman in 1952, in Tennessee, at a time when such pursuit could bring violence or economic retaliation or simply the exhausting machinery of a system designed to deny, would cost more than it returned. But she had kept the deed. She had not thrown it away. She had not let it disappear. She had folded it into the Word of God, between Psalms and Proverbs, in a book she knew her family would keep forever, and she had trusted, not naively, not without understanding the odds, but with the particular deep patience of someone who thinks in generations rather than years, that someone, someday, would find it. Would be ready. Cora Lee hadn't been waiting for a better day for herself. She'd been waiting for a better day for someone she hadn't met yet. A granddaughter she may have held as an infant. A great-great-grandchild she would never see. She had done what black women of her generation had learned to do across centuries of surviving what was unsurvivable. She had compressed her hope and her knowledge and her proof of ownership into the smallest possible container, and she had hidden it somewhere sacred, and she had waited. Esther understood, standing in her kitchen in the March light, that she was not the end of the story. She was the hinge of it. The part where something hidden becomes visible. Where something carried alone for 70 years is finally set down, not in defeat, but in arrival. She wrote back to James Whitfield. She said yes. Over the following months, working with Whitfield, with Patricia Chen, with a non-profit organization that specialized in heir property law, Esther helped locate and contact the families of 2 of the 3 other parcels. One family, a woman in Atlanta whose great-uncle had owned 6 acres, hadn't known the land existed. The other, a man in his 60s living in Nashville, had heard rumors of land from his mother but assumed it was family mythology. It wasn't mythology. It was property. It was theirs. Neither case resolved quickly. These things don't. The legal processes were slow, the records imperfect, the complications real. But they began. Because someone looked. Because someone who had been through the maze herself was willing to walk back into it as a guide. Esther turned 80 in April. Dale came from Portland. Renee came from Phoenix with all 3 kids. Dot made a cake. The grandchildren ran around the small yard of her small house and she watched them from the porch with a cup of coffee, a new mug, one she'd bought herself, plain white. No slogan, and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness seemed too light for it. Not peace, which was too static. Something more active than peace and more grounded than happiness. Something that felt like rightness, like being correctly placed in the world after a period of displacement that went deeper than a house. She had the deed framed. Not the original, that was in the fireproof safe she'd bought specifically for it. A high-quality photocopy, matted in cream, the frame simple and dark-stained oak. It hung in her hallway, visible from the kitchen table where she wrote. Below it, on a small card, she had written a note to herself in her own handwriting. Not from Cora Lee, not a quote, just something she had arrived at herself, in the long quiet of the past year. She didn't lose it. She saved it for when it could be found. She thought about that often. About the difference between losing something and choosing to wait. About how many things we call loss are actually something more patient, something preserved, something held, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to be understood. She thought about Harold, and about how grief had felt at first like a door slamming, and how it felt now more like a window left open, his presence still in the air. Still in the particular way she arranged the coffee mugs, still in the names she called the grandchildren when she forgot herself and used the wrong name, the way grandparents do. She didn't close that window. She let it stay open and the air move through it. She thought about Dale, who called every Sunday now, who had started a slow, careful process of learning who his mother was as a person rather than a role. And whom she was doing the same for in return. She thought about Cora Lee, about a 23-year-old woman leaving Georgia with $40. About a woman who cleaned other people's houses and held the proof of her own land ownership in her grandmother's Bible. About a woman who understood that some truths have to wait for the right moment to be spoken, and who trusted that moment would come even if she never lived to see it. She thought, you were right. It came. The morning light moved across the hallway. The grandchildren laughed somewhere in the yard. The coffee was hot. Esther sat at her kitchen table, opened her notebook, and began to write. There is a question worth sitting with long after this story ends: how many of us are carrying something that belongs to someone else, a truth, a possibility, a deed of some kind, something that has been waiting, folded carefully, tucked in a sacred place, for the moment when someone finally knows to look? And what might change, in your life and in others, if you became the person who looked?